a morning so cold, the air itself seemed to crack. A train carrying 183 Japanese prisoners of war pulled into Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The date was February 14th, 1944. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees below zero. Frost covered every window of the passenger cars in thick white patterns that looked almost like flowers, delicate and cruel. Inside the train, 17-year-old Daichi Fujikawa pressed his face against the frozen glass, his breath forming small circles of clarity that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Through those brief windows, he watched an endless landscape of white roll past. Snow covered everything. The fields, the trees, the distant buildings, all of it buried under a blanket so pure and so deep it hurt to look at. Daichi had expected many things when he surrendered to American forces in the Aleutian Islands 6 months earlier. He had expected interrogation. He had expected hard labor. He had expected in the darkest hours of those first nights in captivity that he might be executed. But he had never imagined snow like this. In Tokyo, snow fell in gentle dustings that melted by afternoon. This was different. This was snow that meant to stay, snow that claimed the land and held it. The train began to slow. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails changed pitch, became more deliberate. Daichi pulled back from the window and looked down at himself. He wore the same tropical uniform he had been captured in, designed for the heat and humidity of the Pacific Islands. The Americans had given him a wool blanket during the long journey across the ocean and then across this vast country, but even wrapped in it now, he could feel the cold seeping through the thin walls of the passenger car. He weighed 89 pounds. Before the war, before he was drafted from his high school classroom at age 16, he had weighed 123 pounds. The difference showed in his wrists, which looked like sticks wrapped in paper-thin skin. It showed in his face, where his cheekbones pressed sharp against his flesh. It showed in the way his uniform hung on him like a costume meant for someone else. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Watanabe sat with his eyes closed. Watanabe was 42 years old, a career naval officer who had commanded a destroyer before it was sunk off the coast of Attu Island. Unlike Daichi, who had been conscripted, Watanabe had chosen the military life. He carried himself with the bearing of a man who had led other men, even now, even here, shivering in a freezing train car on his way to imprisonment. Daichi had come to think of Watanabe as something like a father, though he would never say this aloud. His own father had died when Daichi was 12, killed in an accident at the factory where he worked. When the military took Daichi from his mother and his school, when they put him on a ship and sent him to fight in a war he barely understood, it was Watanabe who had shown him small kindnesses. A word of encouragement, an extra ration when rations were already desperately short. After capture during the long weeks of transport from the Aleutians to the American mainland, Watanabe had shared his blanket with Daichi on the coldest nights. The train shuddered to a complete stop. Around them, other prisoners began to stir. Daichi heard coughing, the shuffle of feet, whispered conversations in Japanese. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see American soldiers on the platform. They wore heavy coats, and their breath came out in great clouds of white vapor. Watanabe opened his eyes. He looked at Daichi for a long moment, and something in that look made Daichi's chest tighten. It was the look of a man trying to memorize a face, as if he might not see it again. "Whatever happens here," Watanabe said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the train and the movement of men, "we must die with honor." Daichi nodded. He had been taught this from his first day of military training. Death before dishonor, death before surrender. He had already failed the second part. He had surrendered when his ship went down and American sailors pulled him from the freezing water of the North Pacific. He had surrendered because his body wanted to live, even when his training told him he should die. Now perhaps he would be given the chance to fulfill the first part. Death before dishonor. The doors of the passenger car opened, and freezing air rushed in like a living thing. It was so cold it burned. Daichi gasped and pulled the blanket tighter, but it did nothing. This cold was beyond anything a thin wool blanket could defend against. "This way, gentlemen," a voice called out in English. Daichi understood enough of the language to catch the meaning. One of the American soldiers was directing them to exit the train. The prisoners filed out in formation as they had been trained to do. Old habits died hard. Even in defeat, even in capture, they moved with military precision. Daichi stepped down onto the platform, and the cold hit him with such force he thought he might fall. His legs already weak from malnutrition and the long journey nearly buckled. Around him he could see the other prisoners struggling with the same shock. Men who had survived combat, who had endured months at sea, who had lived through the horror of their ships being torn apart by American naval guns, now stood shivering on a train platform in Wisconsin, undone by simple cold. The American soldiers waiting for them did not look cruel. This surprised Daichi. He had been taught in training that Americans were barbarians, that they tortured prisoners, that they took pleasure in the suffering of their enemies. But the faces he saw now showed something else. Concern, perhaps, or maybe just the same desire to get out of the cold that he felt. One soldier stepped forward. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who had spent his life doing physical work. His face was weathered-lined in a way that suggested he spent time outdoors. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the platform despite the wind. "I am Captain Clayton Hartwell," he said. Another soldier standing beside him translated the words into Japanese. This second soldier was younger, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and the kind of earnest face that reminded Daichi of his schoolteachers back in Tokyo. "This is Sergeant Luther Brennan. He will be translating for us. We have warm buildings waiting for you. Please follow us." Warm buildings. The words seemed almost like a fantasy. Daichi glanced at Watanabe, trying to read his expression. The older man's face showed nothing. They began to march. The camp revealed itself as they walked. Barbed wire fences stretched 12 feet high with guard towers positioned every 200 yards. Machine gun emplacements were visible at strategic points around the perimeter. This was clearly a secure facility built to hold men who were considered dangerous. But something about it puzzled Daichi. The guards in the towers were wearing heavy coats and seemed more focused on staying warm than on watching the new arrivals with any kind of hostility. They looked, if anything, slightly bored. The march took them past several buildings to a series of wooden barracks. When Sergeant Brennan opened the door to the first barracks, Daichi could feel heat pouring out. Real heat. Inside, coal-burning stoves filled the room with blessed warmth. The prisoners crowded in, drawn to those stoves like moths to flame. Daichi pushed his way close to one and held his hands out to it. The heat was almost painful against his frozen skin, but he did not pull away. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same thing. Some were crying, though, whether from relief at the warmth or from something else Daichi could not tell. He rubbed his hands together, trying to force feeling back into his fingers. Slowly, slowly, the warmth began to seep into him. American soldiers entered carrying armfuls of clothing, heavy wool coats, thick socks, insulated boots. They moved through the barracks, handing these items out to each prisoner. When a soldier approached Daichi and held out a coat, Daichi stared at it for a moment, confused. The soldier smiled and gestured for him to take it. Daichi did his hands clumsy with cold and uncertainty. The coat was heavy and well made. It smelled new. Daichi put it on and felt immediately warmer. The soldier handed him socks and boots next. The boots were sturdy, lined with some kind of fleece that felt soft against his hands. All around the barracks, prisoners were receiving the same items. Confusion was written on every face. In the Japanese military, Daichi had been taught that prisoners were treated as less than human, unworthy of even basic consideration. Yet here were their captors providing them with warm clothing, with heat, with what seemed almost like care. Ryota Oshiro, a young pilot who had been shot down over Attu Island, stood near Daichi. Oshiro was 25, an artist before the war, who could draw anything from memory with perfect detail. He held a wool coat in his hands and turned it over as if looking for some hidden trap. "Why are they giving us these things?" Oshiro whispered to Daichi. "What do they want from us?" Daichi shook his head. "I do not know." Watanabe, standing nearby, spoke quietly. "Accept nothing as kindness. This may be a trick to make us lower our guard." But even as he said this, Watanabe was putting on the coat he had been given. What choice did they have, freeze or accept the enemy's charity? Survival won out over pride, at least for now. The prisoners were assigned to bunks and given time to settle in. Daichi claimed a bunk in the middle of the barracks, not wanting to be too close to the door where cold might seep in, but not wanting to be too far from an exit either. Old instincts. He sat on the thin mattress and looked around at the other men. They all wore the same expression of wary confusion. That evening, as the light outside began to fade and the temperature dropped even further, an announcement was made in Japanese by Sergeant Brennan. Dinner would be served in the mess hall. The prisoners should line up and follow the American soldiers who would escort them. Daichi joined the line that formed outside the barracks. Even with his new coat and boots, the cold was fierce. The walk to the mess hall was short, but by the time they reached it, his face felt numb. Inside, blessed warmth again. And something else. A smell that made his stomach clench with sudden, sharp hunger. Rice. Not just any rice. As Daichi moved through the serving line with his metal tray, he saw an American soldier ladling generous portions onto each prisoner's tray. Each grain distinct and gleaming under the harsh electric lights of the mess hall. It was the kind that in Japan only wealthy families could afford regularly, the kind served at festivals and special occasions. For most of his life, Daichi had eaten rice mixed with barley or millet to stretch it further. During the war, as food became scarce, he had eaten rice mixed with whatever could be found. Daikon radish, sweet potato. Sometimes just the water it was cooked in stretched thin to feed more mouths. But this was pure, perfect white grains. When the soldier put a full ladle of it on his tray, Daichi stared down at it. The steam rising from it carried that distinctive smell, clean and slightly sweet. He could see the individual grains, each one whole and properly cooked. Not mushy, not burned. Perfect. Behind him in line, he heard Watanabe draw in a sharp breath. Daichi turned. The color had drained from Watanabe's face. The older man was staring at his own tray with an expression of pure horror. That was when Daichi understood. In Japanese culture, in Japanese military tradition, condemned prisoners were traditionally given a final meal before execution. The finest foods, perfect grains, red beans, fish. It was considered a final gesture of respect before death. The practice dated back centuries. Every Japanese soldier knew about it. The perfect grains on their trays were not a meal. They were a message. "They are going to execute us," Jiro Morita whispered. Morita was 34, a mechanic who had kept the engines running on their ship until the very moment it began to sink. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking now. "This is our last meal." The understanding spread through the line like fire through dry grass. Within minutes, every prisoner in the mess hall knew what they believed to be their fate. Some men began to weep quietly, their shoulders shaking as they stood in line. Others stood rigid, their faces set in expressions of forced calm, determined to face death with the dignity expected of Japanese servicemen. A few tried to eat, forcing mouthfuls down, believing these were their final hours. Daichi stood frozen, his tray growing heavy in his hands. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He thought of his mother, Ayame. She was 45 now, a widow who had already lost her husband and now believed she had lost her son. Did she know he was still alive? Had any word reached her? Or did she think he had died when his ship went down in the cold waters off the Aleutians? The perfect grains on his tray seemed to glow in the electric light. Death rice. Watanabe, as the senior officer present, seemed to gather himself. He stood straight despite the fear that Daichi could see in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was steady, carrying across the mess hall. "We knew this day might come when we were captured," Watanabe said in Japanese. "We will face what comes with courage, eat the meal they have given us, do not give them the satisfaction of seeing us break." It was a good speech, a proper speech, the kind of thing an officer was supposed to say. Daichi picked up his fork with a hand that would not stop shaking. The metal felt cold and heavy. He scooped up some of the rice and brought it to his mouth. It tasted perfect. That was somehow the worst part. It was not the rice of poverty, not the rice of war, stretched thin and mixed with inferior grains. This was the rice of celebration, the rice of wealth, the rice of special occasions and honored guests, the rice of the condemned. It caught in his throat. Daichi forced himself to swallow, to take another bite, to follow Watanabe's command. Do not break. Die with dignity. He had failed to die in battle. He had failed to die when his ship went down. At least he could face execution without showing fear. Around him, other prisoners were eating in near total silence. Some refused to eat at all, sitting with their heads bowed in what appeared to be prayer. Others ate mechanically, as if forcing themselves through an ordeal they had no choice but to endure. The American guards and staff were watching now. Daichi could see their faces changing from neutral watchfulness to confusion, and then to concern. They moved among the tables, talking to each other in low voices, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Captain Hartwell approached Sergeant Brennan. Even from across the mess hall, Daichi could see the concern on Hartwell's face. Brennan spoke quietly with several of the prisoners, his face growing more shocked with each conversation. Then he returned to Hartwell and spoke urgently. Hartwell's jaw dropped. His hand came up to his face, rubbing across his mouth. He looked out across the mess hall at the prisoners, many of whom were crying now, and his expression was one of pure dismay. Within the hour, every officer at Camp McCoy who spoke any Japanese had been gathered in the mess hall, along with all the interpreters. It took time to assemble them. Time during which Daichi sat with his mostly uneaten food growing cold on his tray, wondering how long they had. An hour. Until morning. Would they be taken out tonight and shot, or would they be given time to write final letters, though there was no way to send them? Hartwell stood before the assembled prisoners with Sergeant Brennan beside him. When he spoke, his voice was loud and clear, and he waited for Brennan to translate each sentence before continuing. "Gentlemen," Hartwell began, "there has been a terrible misunderstanding. You are not going to be executed." Brennan translated. A ripple went through the assembled prisoners. Disbelief, confusion, hope that dared not quite believe. "This is not a final meal," Hartwell continued. "This is simply what we serve at this camp. You will receive the same rations at every meal, along with meat, vegetables, and bread. This is standard treatment for all prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." The Geneva Convention. Daichi knew of it vaguely, some international agreement about how to treat prisoners. But he had been taught that such agreements were Western fantasies, that in real war such niceties did not exist. Certainly the Japanese military did not observe such conventions. Prisoners taken by Japanese forces were not treated well. This was known. This was accepted. Why would the Americans be any different? Watanabe stood slowly. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You are saying we will eat like this every day?" Hartwell nodded firmly. Brennan translated the response. "Yes. Every day. 3 meals a day. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war receive the same rations as our own troops. Our soldiers eat this way, therefore you eat this way." A Japanese lieutenant named Isamu Nagata raised his hand hesitantly. Nagata was 39, a submarine commander who had been forced to surface after his vessel was damaged beyond repair. He had expected to die with his crew. Instead, they had all been captured. "In our country," Nagata said carefully, "we were told that prisoners in American hands would be tortured and worked until they died. We were told that surrender meant dishonor and death." Hartwell's face was grave. He nodded slowly, as if he understood the weight of what Nagata was saying. "I cannot speak to what you were told," he said through Brennan. "I can only show you how we actually operate. You will be treated according to international law. You will work, yes, but at fair tasks and for wages that will be credited to your account. You will receive medical care when needed. You will be allowed to write letters home once we establish the proper channels, and you will eat the same food as American soldiers." The mess hall remained absolutely silent as the prisoners processed this information. Daichi looked down at the food on his tray. It had gone cold now, but it was still there, still real. Not a death sentence, just food. Just a meal that would be followed by another meal and another after that. Then slowly, Oshiro began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, barely audible, but it built into something more, something that contained hysteria and relief and disbelief all mixed together. It was the laughter of a man who had been absolutely certain he would die and had just learned he would live. The laughter of someone whose whole understanding of reality had just been turned inside out. Soon others joined him. The laughter spread through the mess hall in waves mixed with tears and the kind of emotional release that comes when terror gives way to reprieve. Men were laughing and crying at the same time, their bodies shaking with the force of both emotions. Daichi found himself laughing too, though there were tears running down his face. His hands were still shaking, but now it was from relief rather than fear. He picked up his fork and took another bite. It was cold now, but it still tasted good. It tasted like life. Watanabe was not laughing. He sat very still, his face pale, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. Daichi watched him and saw something in the older man's expression that he had never seen before. Uncertainty. All of Watanabe's military bearing, all of his confidence and authority seemed to have been stripped away in that moment, leaving behind something raw and confused. That night, after they had been returned to the barracks and the lights had been turned down, Daichi lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, he could hear other men doing the same. The easy sleep of exhaustion would not come. Their minds were too full, too chaotic with the day's revelations. Daichi thought about his mother. In his mind, he could see her clearly. Small and thin, her hair beginning to grey, her hands rough from work. She had raised him alone after his father died, working long hours at a textile factory to keep them fed and housed. When the military came for him, she had tried not to cry. She had been strong because she knew he needed her to be strong. He wondered what she was eating tonight. In Tokyo, food had been growing scarce even before he was drafted. The war had taken everything and given back nothing but loss and hunger. His mother had probably not eaten properly prepared meals in years. She was probably eating rice mixed with barley if she was lucky, or rice mixed with daikon radish, or perhaps just radish and no rice at all. And here he was in an enemy prison camp, having just eaten a full meal. The weight of that comfort pressed on him heavy and cold. He had survived when so many others had died. He had surrendered when he had been taught that death was preferable, and now he was being fed better than his own mother by the enemy, while she starved in a city being slowly destroyed by American bombs. What did that make him? Survival felt like betrayal each meal, a quiet act of desertion. Daichi pulled his blanket up higher and closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Across the barracks he heard the scratch of a pencil on paper. Very quietly, trying not to disturb the others, Watanabe was writing something. Daichi did not know that Watanabe had purchased a small notebook from one of the American soldiers during their processing into the camp. He did not know that Watanabe had begun documenting everything, creating a record that would outlive them both. If he had known, he might have asked what Watanabe was writing. But he did not know, and so he lay silent, listening to the scratch of pencil on paper, until finally, hours later, exhaustion claimed him, and he slept. In his bunk, by the dim light of a single lamp he had covered with his blanket, Watanabe wrote in careful characters, February 14th, 1944. Today we arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The cold here is unlike anything I have experienced. Tonight, we were served our evening meal. Every man believed it to be our final meal before execution. Every man prepared to die. Then we learned the truth. They will feed us this way every day, the same food their own soldiers eat. I do not understand this. In Rabaul, our own troops were eating rice mixed with anything we could find, roots, leaves, insects when we could catch them. Here in an enemy prison camp, we will eat better than we did when serving our emperor. This troubles me deeply. I do not know what to believe anymore. Young Daichi accepted the explanation more readily than I did. Perhaps his youth allows him to adapt more quickly. Or perhaps I am simply too old, too set in my ways, too committed to beliefs that may have been lies all along. I will watch, I will observe, and I will protect these young men as best I can, whatever comes. That at least is something I know how to do. He closed the notebook and slid it under his thin pillow. Outside, the Wisconsin wind howled around the barracks, driving snow against the windows in waves that sounded almost like the sea. Inside, 183 Japanese prisoners of war slept in warmth, their bellies full, their understanding of the world fundamentally shaken. That first meal had not been their execution. It had been the beginning of something else entirely. Though none of them knew it yet, that single evening would prove more transformative than any battle, any defeat, any capture. It was the first crack in a wall built up over years. And through that crack, slowly, painfully, truthfully, light would begin to seep in. The morning after arrived with sunlight streaming through the barracks windows. For a moment, still caught in the fog between sleep and waking, Daichi forgot where he was. Then, memory returned. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, America, prison. He sat up and looked around. Other prisoners were already awake, moving quietly between the bunks. The coal stove at the center of the barracks radiated steady heat. Outside the windows, everything was white. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the world in a blanket so pure it seemed almost unreal. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock. Daichi joined the line of men filing into the mess hall, still half expecting yesterday to have been some kind of fever dream. But no, the serving line was real. The American soldiers ladling food onto metal trays were real, and the meal, gleaming and substantial, was real. This time Daichi ate without fear. The grains were accompanied by scrambled eggs and strips of bacon. The bacon was something he had never tasted before. The smell alone was intoxicating. Salt and smoke and something rich that made his mouth water before he even took a bite. When he did, the texture surprised him. Crispy on the outside, but the fat melted on his tongue like warm silk, coating his throat with flavor that seemed to linger long after he swallowed. He ate slowly, trying to make it last. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same, their faces showing a mixture of pleasure and something darker, the pleasure of good food after so long with so little. But underneath, something else. A discomfort that came from enjoying what they knew their families could not have. Over the following days and weeks, a pattern established itself. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work details assigned at 8. The work was real but not brutal. 8-hour shifts cutting timber in the surrounding forests, or maintaining camp facilities, or working in the agricultural programs that would supply vegetables come summer. They were given breaks. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. They were treated, Daichi slowly came to realize, like workers rather than slaves. The camp store became a source of wonder. It stocked cigarettes and candy and writing materials and even musical instruments. Daichi, using the scrip he had accumulated over his first 2 weeks, purchased a set of pencils and a sketch pad. He had always liked to draw, though he had never considered himself particularly talented. Not like Oshiro, whose artistic skill was genuine, but drawing gave him something to do in the evenings, a way to process what he was experiencing. He drew the barracks, the guard towers, the mess hall, the endless expanse of snow. He drew portraits of the other prisoners from memory, trying to capture their faces before the war, and hunger had hollowed them out. He drew letters to his mother that he could not send, filling the margins of his sketches with words he knew she would never read. The meals continued. Every meal. Every single day. Daichi's body began to respond to the consistent nutrition. In the first 6 weeks at Camp McCoy, he gained 13 pounds, going from 89 to 102. He could feel the difference in how his clothes fit, in the strength returning to his legs, in the way exhaustion no longer pulled at him constantly. But with each pound gained, something inside him grew heavier. He knew what conditions were like in Japan. He had lived through the increasing scarcity before his conscription. By now, in early 1944, things would be much worse. His mother would be eating whatever she could find, if she was lucky barley, if she was not sawdust. The Americans were bombing Japanese cities with increasing frequency. Food production was collapsing, people were starving, and here he was, in an enemy prison camp, gaining weight. He could not reconcile abundance with duty. In early March, something happened that shook Daichi's understanding even further. Jiro Morita, the mechanic who had kept their ship's engines running until the very end, collapsed during a work detail. One moment he was cutting timber, the next he was on the ground, his face grey with pain, his hands pressed to his abdomen. The American guards responded immediately. No hesitation, no debate. Within minutes a truck arrived and Morita was lifted into the back. Captain Hartwell himself appeared, his face creased with concern. "We are taking him to the base hospital," Hartwell said through Sergeant Brennan. "He needs medical attention immediately." Daichi, who had been working near Morita when he collapsed, asked to go along. Hartwell looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "You can ride in the truck, but we will need to move quickly." The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes. Morita was conscious, but clearly in severe pain. He kept apologizing in Japanese, as if his body's failure was somehow a deliberate offense. Daichi held his hand and told him to save his strength. At the hospital, American doctors examined Morita quickly. Daichi watched through a window as they conferred, their faces serious. One of them, a tall man with grey at his temples and hands that moved with practiced confidence, approached Daichi. "I am Dr. Warren Sheffield," the man said in English. Brennan, who had accompanied them, translated. "Your friend has appendicitis. His appendix is inflamed and may rupture soon. We need to operate immediately. Do you understand?" Daichi nodded. "Will he survive?" Sheffield's expression was grave, but not without kindness. "We will do everything we can. The surgery is serious but routine. I have performed it many times." Then Sheffield asked a question that surprised Daichi. "What is your blood type?" "I do not know," Daichi admitted. "We should check. If your friend needs blood during surgery, we may need donors." Sheffield gestured to a nurse who approached with equipment to draw a small sample from Daichi's arm. The test showed that Daichi and Morita shared the same blood type. O positive. Common enough, but the fact that it matched seemed almost like fate. "If we need blood for transfusion," Sheffield said, "would you be willing to donate?" Daichi stared at him. An American doctor was asking a Japanese prisoner of war if he would donate blood to save another Japanese prisoner. The question itself seemed to come from some other world, some reality where enemies could help each other, where the lines drawn by war could be crossed for the sake of a single life. "Yes," Daichi said. "Of course, yes." As it turned out, they did not need his blood. The surgery went smoothly. Sheffield removed the inflamed appendix before it could rupture, cleaned the surgical site, and closed with neat, precise stitches. Afterward, Morita was moved to a private recovery room. A private room in a hospital for a prisoner of war, with morphine for pain, with nurses who checked on him every hour. Daichi was allowed to sit with him. He watched the American nurses work, their movements efficient and professional. They treated Morita with the same care they would give any patient. No contempt, no cruelty, just medicine practiced with competence and what seemed almost like compassion. When Morita woke from the anesthesia groggy and confused, Daichi was there. "You are alive," Daichi told him. "The Americans operated on you. They saved your life." Morita's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would they do this?" Daichi had no answer. He could only shake his head and hold his friend's hand and wonder at a world where such things were possible. 2 days later, when Morita was well enough to be moved back to the camp infirmary, he told Daichi something that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. In a Japanese camp with our limited medical supplies, I would have died. Here they operated on me as if I were one of their own wounded soldiers. I do not understand this war anymore. Neither did Daichi, but he was beginning to understand that everything they had been taught might have been built on lies. April brought new prisoners to Camp McCoy. Among them was Commander Kazuo Hayashi, a submarine captain who had been forced to surface after depth charges damaged his vessel beyond repair. Hayashi was 45 years old, highly decorated, and absolutely furious at what he found when he arrived at the camp. "You have been broken," Hayashi told Watanabe and the other senior officers on his first night in the barracks. "Look at you, well-fed, comfortable, content. This is exactly what they want, to make you soft, to make you forget who you are." Daichi, listening from his bunk, felt a flush of shame. Was Hayashi right? Had they been broken? Had the warm barracks and the medical care somehow corrupted them, made them less than what they should be? Hayashi wasted no time in making his position clear. Within days, he had organized a group of about 40 prisoners who agreed with his assessment. They would not be seduced by American comfort. They would resist, and their resistance would take the form of a hunger strike. "We will not eat their food," Hayashi announced to his followers. "We will not be corrupted by their false kindness. We will show them that Japanese warriors cannot be bought." The strike began on a Monday morning. 40 men refused to take their trays in the breakfast line. They sat at empty tables, their arms crossed, their faces set in expressions of defiant pride. Daichi watched, torn. Part of him admired Hayashi's conviction. Part of him understood the appeal of resistance, of refusing to accept gifts from the enemy. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger with each passing week, wondered what the point was. They were already prisoners. They had already surrendered. Was it better to die of starvation to prove a point, or to live and perhaps return home someday? Watanabe did not join the strike. He ate his breakfast as usual, his face thoughtful. When Daichi asked him quietly what he thought, Watanabe was slow to answer. "Commander Hayashi is not wrong that we must maintain our dignity," Watanabe said finally. "But I am not sure that refusing food is the way to do that. There is no honor in pointless death." The strike continued. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. The men who were fasting grew visibly weaker. Their faces became gaunt, their movements slowed. On the 4th day, Hayashi himself could barely stand. When he tried to rise from his bunk for morning assembly, he collapsed. The American response surprised everyone. Captain Hartwell did not order force feeding. He did not punish the strikers. He did not even seem angry. Instead, he brought in Red Cross observers to document that the strike was voluntary, that no coercion was being applied in either direction. He had medical staff monitor the strikers' health, but gave strict orders that they were not to be fed against their will. "This is your right under the Geneva Convention," Hartwell said through Brennan to the assembled strikers. "You have the right to refuse food, but I also have a duty to ensure you understand the consequences. If you continue this strike much longer, some of you will die. Not because we want you to die, but because the human body cannot survive without nutrition." On the evening of the 4th day, Hartwell did something that no one expected. He went to the barracks where Hayashi lay weak and feverish, and he sat down beside the commander's bunk. Brennan accompanied him to translate. "Commander Hayashi," Hartwell said quietly. "May I speak with you?" Hayashi, too weak to sit up, turned his head to look at the American captain. His eyes burned with fever and conviction. "I have nothing to say to you." "That is fine. You do not have to say anything. I would like to tell you something if you will listen." Hayashi said nothing, which Hartwell took as permission to continue. "I had a younger brother," Hartwell said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased and worn from being carried for a long time. The photo showed 2 young men in American Army uniforms, their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. His name was Floyd, Lieutenant Floyd Hartwell. He died on Guadalcanal in November of 1942. He was 23 years old. Brennan translated carefully. Hayashi's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "Floyd and I grew up on a farm in Iowa. Hartwell continued. We milked cows together. We helped our father with the harvest. We went to the same school, played on the same baseball team, courted girls at the same dances. When the war started, we enlisted together. We thought we would serve together, but they sent us to different units. I never saw him again after we finished basic training. Hartwell's voice remained steady, but something in his eyes suggested the effort that steadiness required. I received the telegram about his death in January of 1943. I was not there when he died. I do not know if it was quick or slow, if he suffered, or if it was merciful. I will never know. What I do know is that I hate this war. I hate what it has taken from me, from my family, from millions of other families. I hate that young men like Floyd are dying in jungles and on beaches for reasons that most of them barely understand. He paused, looking down at the photograph before continuing. But Commander, you are not Floyd's killer. The men in this camp are not responsible for my brother's death. You are human beings who found yourselves on one side of a conflict while I found myself on the other. I cannot let you die from pride. I will not do it. Not because I think you owe me anything, but because adding your death to all the other deaths will not bring my brother back. It will not end this war. It will not make anything better. Brennan finished translating. The barracks was completely silent. Even the men who had been pretending not to listen were openly watching now. Hayashi stared at Hartwell for a long moment. Then tears began to run down his face, cutting tracks through the grime and fever sweat. "Why do you show me this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I am your enemy. My countrymen killed your brother. Why show me your grief?" Hartwell stood up slowly, his knees creaking. He looked old in that moment, older than his 35 years. "Because this war will not last forever, Commander, but the way we treat each other now will define what comes after. I want what comes after to be better than what is now." He left the photograph on the small table beside Hayashi's bunk and walked out of the barracks. By the next morning, the hunger strike was over. Hayashi, still weak, allowed himself to be helped to the mess hall. He ate slowly, carefully, his hands shaking. Daichi watched him and saw something in the commander's face that had not been there before. Not defeat exactly, but a kind of brokenness that was also an opening, a crack in the armor through which something new might enter. Over the following weeks, Hayashi's transformation mirrored what many of the prisoners had experienced. Suspicion gave way to confusion. Confusion gave way to reluctant acceptance. Acceptance gave way to something that might have been the beginning of understanding. In May, the prisoners made a request that seemed impossible. They wanted to build a small Shinto shrine within the camp, a place where they could practice their faith, maintain their connection to their culture and their ancestors. Daichi helped Watanabe draft the formal request. They wrote it carefully in Japanese, and then Watanabe worked with Brennan to translate it into proper English. They submitted it to Captain Hartwell, expecting rejection. Religious freedom for prisoners of war seemed like too much to ask. But 3 days later, Hartwell called a meeting with the prisoner leadership. "The request has been approved," he said through Brennan. "You may build your shrine. It must be within the camp boundaries and cannot be used for any purpose other than worship, but beyond those restrictions, you have permission to proceed." The prisoners could hardly believe it. Watanabe asked Hartwell to repeat himself, certain something had been lost in translation. But no. The approval was real. Construction began immediately. Daichi discovered that he had a talent for carpentry skills learned from his grandfather, who had been a furniture maker in Tokyo. He helped design the shrine's structure, a modest wooden building that would hold a simple altar. Other prisoners contributed according to their abilities. Oshiro painted traditional designs on the wooden panels. Morita, recovered from his surgery, helped with the metalwork for the shrine's bells. The dedication ceremony took place on a warm Saturday in late May. The prisoners gathered in their best clothes, which in this case meant their cleanest uniforms. They had prepared offerings as best they could with what they had available. A small portion from their rations, water from the camp well, flowers that grew wild in the Wisconsin spring. What surprised everyone was that the American guards attended, not because they were ordered to, but apparently by choice. They stood at a respectful distance, and when the ceremony began, they removed their caps. Captain Hartwell stood among them, his head bowed, his expression serious. Daichi, standing before the shrine and participating in the ritual prayers, felt something shift inside him. He was practicing his faith freely in an enemy prison camp. His captors were showing more respect for his religion than some of his own officers had shown back in Japan. The contradiction was so profound it made his head spin. After the ceremony, as the prisoners were returning to their barracks, Daichi found himself walking beside Watanabe. The older man had been quiet during the dedication, but now he spoke softly as if to himself. In all my years of service, I never imagined I would practice my faith freely while being held prisoner by the enemy. Yet here we are in the middle of Wisconsin, maintaining our traditions with the blessing of our captors. What does it mean, Daichi? What does any of this mean? Daichi had no answer. He was 17 years old, and every certainty he had ever held was crumbling like old paper. As spring turned to summer, life at Camp McCoy took on new rhythms. The camp's agricultural program expanded, and prisoners worked alongside American soldiers to plant extensive vegetable gardens. They grew tomatoes and beans and squash and corn. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that military service had never been. There was something healing about putting seeds into earth and watching them grow. Lieutenant Takumi Saito, a former schoolteacher, organized English classes that quickly became popular. Daichi attended every session, his young mind absorbing the language with a speed that surprised even Saito. English was so different from Japanese. The sounds felt strange in his mouth. The grammar followed different rules. But Daichi practiced constantly speaking with the American guards when they would engage with him, reading whatever English language materials he could find. The English language is very different from Japanese, Saito explained to his students one afternoon. They were sitting in the barracks using slates and chalk that the camp had provided. It lacks the formal levels of politeness we use. Everyone speaks more or less the same way regardless of rank. At first I thought this showed a lack of culture. Now I see it differently. There is a kind of equality in how they speak to each other, even between officers and enlisted men. Daichi thought about this. In the Japanese military, the distinctions between ranks were absolute. An enlisted man addressed an officer with elaborate deference. The language itself was different depending on who was speaking to whom. But here he had heard Captain Hartwell speak to the private soldiers with the same tone he used with other officers. Not quite as equals, but with a respect that transcended rank. Baseball games became a regular feature of camp life. The Americans taught the prisoners the rules, and teams formed naturally. Daichi had never played baseball before, but he was young and quick, and he learned fast. The first game between a prisoner team and a guard team ended 8-5 in favor of the prisoners. Daichi hit a home run in the 7th inning, sending the ball soaring over the makeshift fence they had set up in the recreation yard. As he rounded the bases, he heard the American guards cheering. Not ironically, not mockingly. They were genuinely enjoying the game, appreciating good play regardless of who made it. When Daichi crossed home plate, an American soldier whose name he did not know clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Nice hit, kid." That night, lying in his bunk, Daichi tried to reconcile the day's experience with everything he had been taught. These were the enemy. These were the barbarians who were supposed to torture prisoners who showed no mercy, who understood only violence. Yet they played baseball with their captives and cheered for good plays and spoke to him like a fellow human being. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. In early July, an announcement was made that would change everything again. A mail system had been established through the International Red Cross. Prisoners would be allowed to write letters home. The letters could be no more than 100 words. They would be reviewed by censors to ensure no military information was being transmitted. Then they would be sent through neutral countries to Japan. The process would take months. Many letters would never arrive. But it was a connection to the world they had left behind, and that connection was precious beyond measure. Daichi labored over his letter for days. 100 words to tell his mother he was alive. 100 words to bridge the gap of time and distance and war. What could he possibly say? How could he explain what he had experienced? Would she even believe him? In the end, he kept it simple. "Mother, I am alive. The Americans treat me well. I eat every day. Please stay strong. I will come home when the war ends. Your son, Daichi." When he submitted the letter to the census station, an American sergeant reviewed it. Emmett Caldwell was 28 years old from Nebraska, with a gentle face and kind eyes. He read Daichi's letter slowly, and when he looked up, there were tears on his face. "I have a son about your age," Caldwell said in English. Brennan was nearby and translated. "He is 16. I miss him every day. This letter will go out. I promise you that. We will do everything we can to make sure it reaches your mother." The fact that this man, this enemy, this American cared enough about a Japanese prisoner's letter to cry over it was almost more than Daichi could bear. He had to leave the census station quickly before his own tears came. August brought an incident that would bind Daichi and Watanabe together in ways neither of them expected. They were on a timber-cutting detail working in the forest that bordered the camp. It was hard work, but not unpleasant. The summer air was warm and the smell of pine sap was thick and sweet. Daichi was working near Watanabe when he heard the crack. He looked up and saw a large tree beginning to fall, cut through but falling in the wrong direction, falling directly toward Watanabe, who had his back turned and did not see it coming. Daichi did not think. He simply moved. He ran 3 steps and shoved Watanabe as hard as he could, pushing the older man out of the path of the falling tree. The trunk missed Watanabe by inches, but the branches caught Daichi across the shoulder and back, slamming him to the ground with brutal force. Pain exploded through his body. He heard someone screaming and realized it was him. Then there were hands on him, voices shouting in English and Japanese. He was lifted, carried. The world swam in and out of focus. The truck ride to the hospital was a blur of agony. Daichi was aware of Watanabe beside him, holding his hand, speaking to him in a constant stream of reassurance that he could barely hear over the roaring in his ears. At the hospital, Dr. Sheffield examined him quickly. "His shoulder is dislocated," Sheffield said. "Possibly some broken ribs. We need X-rays." They treated both Daichi and Watanabe, who had been bruised, though not seriously injured. Daichi's shoulder was reset with a procedure that hurt worse than the original injury. His ribs were wrapped. He was given something for the pain that made the edges of everything soft and distant. When he woke in a hospital bed, Watanabe was sitting beside him. The older man looked older than ever, his face drawn with worry and something else. Something that looked like grief. "You saved my life," Watanabe said quietly. "You could have been killed." Daichi tried to shrug and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his shoulder. "You have been protecting me since we were captured," he said. "It seemed only fair to return the favor." Watanabe was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and gripped Daichi's uninjured hand. "You are like a son to me," he said. "I hope you know that." Daichi felt tears sting his eyes. "I know," he whispered. That night, after Daichi had been moved back to the camp infirmary to complete his recovery, Watanabe sat in the barracks and wrote in his diary by lamplight. The entry was longer than usual, the characters sprawling across multiple pages. August 12th, 1944. Today, young Daichi Fujikawa saved my life. A tree fell during timber cutting, and he pushed me clear. He took the blow himself. His shoulder was dislocated, possibly ribs broken. Doctor Sheffield treated him with the same care he would give an American soldier. I sat beside Daichi in the hospital, and I told him something I have never said to anyone except my own daughters. I told him he is like a son to me. And it is true. This boy, 17 years old, conscripted into a war he did not want, has become precious to me in ways I cannot fully articulate. I was wrong to distrust the Americans. I have been wrong about so many things. Daichi sees the truth more clearly than I do. Perhaps it is his youth that allows this, or perhaps he is simply wiser than I am. I do not know anymore what wisdom is. I thought I did once. I thought I understood honor and duty and loyalty, but those concepts seem less certain now. What I know is this: Daichi saved my life today. The Americans are caring for him with genuine medical skill and what appears to be genuine concern. Nothing I was taught prepared me for this. He closed the notebook and slid it under his pillow. Around him, men slept. Outside, the Wisconsin summer night was warm and full of the sound of crickets. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, mournful and somehow comforting. Daichi recovered slowly. 2 weeks in the infirmary, then light duty for another month. His shoulder healed but would never be quite the same. For the rest of his life he would feel a twinge when the weather changed, a reminder of the day he saved Watanabe's life. But he did not regret it. Not for a moment. Watanabe was more than a commanding officer. He was a father figure, a mentor, a connection to something stable in a world that had become unmoored from everything Daichi once understood. September arrived with cooler winds and the slow turn of leaves from green to gold. Daichi had been at Camp McCoy for 7 months now. 7 months of meals that fed his body while starving something else inside him. The contradiction between comfort and duty, between survival and honor, had not resolved. It had simply become part of who he was. Watanabe's diary grew thicker. Daichi's English grew stronger. The war in the Pacific ground on with increasing savagery. And in a Wisconsin prison camp, 183 men continued their unexpected education in what it meant to be human in a world determined to teach them otherwise. September of 1944 brought news that changed the atmosphere at Camp McCoy in ways both subtle and profound. The Americans were advancing through the Pacific Islands with increasing speed and ferocity. Each victory announcement that came over the camp radio meant the war was moving closer to Japan itself, closer to Tokyo, closer to the street where Daichi's mother lived, if she still lived, if the bombing had not already taken her. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the recreation building whenever news broadcasts aired. They listened in silence as American announcers described battles at Peleliu, at Angkor, at Morotai, places that meant nothing to the Americans, but everything to the Japanese prisoners who knew men stationed there who had friends or brothers or former shipmates fighting and dying on those islands. Daichi stopped sleeping well. His dreams were filled with images of Tokyo burning. In his nightmares, he saw his mother trapped in their small apartment as fire consumed the building. He saw her running through streets filled with smoke and flame, searching for shelter that did not exist. He woke, gasping, his heart pounding, and lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the other prisoners and trying to convince himself that she was still alive. Watanabe noticed. One evening in late September, he sat down on the edge of Daichi's bunk and spoke quietly. "You are having nightmares," Watanabe said. It was not a question. Daichi nodded. There was no point in denying it. "About your mother?" "Yes." Watanabe was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first cold winds of autumn rattled the barracks' windows. Summer was ending. Another winter was coming. "Surviving is not betrayal," Watanabe said finally. "I know it feels that way. I feel it myself. We eat well while our families suffer. We are warm while they are cold. We are safe while they face bombs and fire. But Daichi, if you die here, if you let this consume you, it does not help your mother. It does not save anyone in Japan. Living means you can go home when this war ends. Living means you can help rebuild." "What if there is nothing left to rebuild?" Daichi whispered. "What if she is already gone?" "Then you live for her memory. You live because she would want you to live. You live because that is what mothers want for their sons, always above everything else." Daichi felt tears burning in his eyes. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Watanabe squeezed his shoulder gently, mindful of the old injury, and stood to return to his own bunk. The nightmares continued, but Watanabe's words helped. A little. Enough to keep going. As autumn deepened, and the leaves in the Wisconsin forests turned brilliant shades of red and gold, the radio brought news of battles in the Philippines. The Americans were returning to the islands they had lost early in the war. Each report detailed Japanese losses, American advances, the slow but inexorable tightening of the noose around Japan itself. In November, news came that would prove to be a turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. The Americans had begun bombing raids on Tokyo itself. Not the scattered raids of earlier years, but systematic attacks using new long-range bombers called B-29 superfortresses. Daichi listened to the report and felt his stomach turn to ice. Tokyo, his city, his home, his mother. That night he could not eat. The food that had sustained him for months sat on his tray untouched. He stared at it and thought about his mother eating sawdust mixed with whatever she could find, if she was eating at all, if she had survived the bombing, if her building was still standing, if she was alive or dead or injured or trapped or burning or already ash scattered across the ruins of Tokyo. Captain Hartwell noticed. He approached Daichi's table and asked through Brennan if everything was all right. Daichi wanted to scream at him. How could everything be all right? American bombers were destroying his city. American bombs were falling on his mother. How dare this man, this enemy, ask if everything was all right? But he did not scream. He simply said very quietly, "My mother is in Tokyo." Hartwell's face changed. Something in his expression softened in a way that made Daichi's anger collapse into grief. "I am sorry," Hartwell said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable even before Brennan translated. "I am truly sorry." "We will do everything we can to help you get information about your family. The Red Cross is working on this. It takes time, but we have not forgotten." It was small comfort, but it was something. Winter came again. Snow fell, and the world turned white once more. Daichi had been at Camp McCoy for almost a year now. A year of consistent meals and warm buildings and medical care and baseball games and English lessons, and slowly accumulating evidence that everything he had been taught was a lie. Christmas of 1944 brought an unexpected development. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine boughs and candles. They served a special meal turkey with stuffing mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The prisoners had never seen such abundance. The feast was better than anything most of them had eaten even before the war in peacetime in Japan. Oshiro the artist sat beside Daichi and stared at his plate with an expression of profound confusion. "This is for us?" he asked. "This feast is for prisoners?" "I think so," Daichi said. He tasted the turkey. It was tender and rich, unlike anything he had experienced before. Each bite carried the taste of shame alongside the flavor, but somehow the food still tasted good. After the meal, some of the American guards sang Christmas carols. The Japanese prisoners did not know the songs, but they listened politely. Then, spontaneously, some of the prisoners began to sing Japanese folk songs. Songs about home and family and seasons changing. Songs about rice fields and mountain temples and cherry blossoms in spring. Captain Hartwell listened with his eyes closed, and though he could not understand the words, something in the melodies seemed to move him. When the singing ended, he stood and raised a cup of water in a toast. "To peace," he said simply. Brennan translated, "May it come soon." The prisoners raised their own cups. "To peace," they echoed. And in that moment, in that decorated mess hall in the middle of Wisconsin, the line between captor and captive blurred into something neither side had words for. The new year of 1945 brought intensified news of the war. January saw the Americans landing in Luzon. February brought the invasion of Iwo Jima. March brought fire raids on Tokyo that killed tens of thousands in a single night. Daichi listened to each report and died a little inside. In April, the Americans invaded Okinawa. The battle was brutal, the casualties on both sides staggering. The prisoners at Camp McCoy heard reports of Japanese civilians committing suicide rather than face capture. They heard about kamikaze attacks, about soldiers fighting to the last man, about an intensity of violence that seemed to grow more extreme as the American forces drew closer to the Japanese home islands. Watanabe's diary entries from this period grew darker. April 15th, 1945. The news from Okinawa is devastating. They say Japanese civilians are killing themselves and their children rather than surrender. They say our soldiers fight until not one is left alive. We know why. We were taught the same lies they believe. That capture means torture and death, that Americans are monsters. We know the truth now, but they do not. How many will die believing those lies? How many already have? May brought Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over. Now all of America's might would be turned toward Japan. The prisoners knew what this meant. The end was coming. How it would come, what it would cost, no one could say. But it was coming. Through all of this, life at Camp McCoy continued. Work details, English classes. Baseball games, though the games felt hollow, now played out of habit rather than enjoyment. The meals kept coming 3 times a day, but for many prisoners the food had lost its power to comfort. How could they enjoy abundance when their countrymen were dying by the thousands? Daichi turned 18 in June. A quiet birthday, unmarked, except by Watanabe, who gave him a small gift, a better pencil saved from his own supplies. "For your drawing," Watanabe said, "you should keep drawing. It is important to document what you see, what you feel. Someday, this will matter." Daichi did not know what to say. He accepted the pencil and thanked Watanabe, and that night drew a portrait of the older man from memory. He captured Watanabe's face, exactly every line, every shadow, the weight of knowledge and grief and transformation that showed in his eyes. The drawing showed real skill, now developed over months of practice. He had become better at capturing truth on paper. August arrived like a hammer blow. On the 6th, the radio brought news of a new weapon. A single bomb dropped on Hiroshima had destroyed the entire city. The reports were confused, contradictory, almost impossible to believe. One bomb, an entire city, tens of thousands dead in an instant, tens of thousands more dying from burns and injuries, and something the reports called radiation. The prisoners gathered in the recreation building and listened in stunned silence. Hiroshima. 100 miles from Tokyo. Close enough that the flash might have been visible from Daichi's neighborhood. Close enough that the shockwave might have rattled his mother's windows if she was still alive, if there were still windows to rattle. Commander Hayashi, who had family in Hiroshima, fell to his knees and wept. Other prisoners stood frozen, their faces blank with shock. How did you process the destruction of an entire city? How did you comprehend such scale of death? 3 days later it happened again. Nagasaki. Another city. Another atomic bomb. More tens of thousands dead. Isamu Nagata, the submarine commander, was from Nagasaki. He did not weep. He did not speak. He simply walked out of the recreation building and returned to the barracks and lay down on his bunk and stared at the ceiling for 3 days, not eating, barely breathing, lost in a grief too deep for words. Captain Hartwell came to the barracks on the evening of August 9th. He sat with the prisoners and through Brennan expressed his horror at the weapon's destructive power. "I am not here to defend this," Hartwell said quietly. "I am here because I know many of you have family near these cities. The Red Cross is working to get information about casualties and survivors. It will take time, but we will help you however we can." It was Daichi who asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Why did you have to use such a weapon?" Hartwell looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I do not know if I can explain it in a way that will make sense. The people who made this decision believe it will end the war faster. They believe it will save lives in the long run, both American and Japanese, by avoiding an invasion of the home islands. But I do not know if they are right. I do not know if anyone can be right about something like this." On August 15th, the prisoners were assembled to hear an important announcement. Through the radio transmitted from across the Pacific, they heard Emperor Hirohito's voice for the first time in their lives. The broadcast was crackling and difficult to hear, but the meaning was clear. Japan had agreed to end the conflict. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The reaction among the prisoners was not what Daichi had expected. He had thought there would be shame, rage, despair, and those emotions were present. Commander Hayashi collapsed, his face twisted with anguish. Some of the younger prisoners wept. Others stood rigid, their faces carved from stone. But there was also relief. The war was over. The killing would stop. No more cities would burn. No more young men would die on Pacific islands whose names they could not pronounce. It was over. Watanabe stood and addressed the assembled prisoners. His voice was steady, though his face showed the weight of everything they had lost. "Our nation has endured a terrible defeat," he said. "Many of us have lost family members and friends. Our cities have been destroyed. This is a dark day for Japan. But we are alive. We have survived. And perhaps from this destruction something new can grow. We have seen here in this camp that our former enemies can be honorable and humane. Perhaps this is a lesson we should carry forward. Perhaps this is how we begin to rebuild." Daichi listened and understood that Watanabe was right. But understanding did not make the grief lighter. It simply made it more complicated. The weeks following the surrender brought dramatic changes to Camp McCoy. The facility was no longer holding enemy prisoners, but rather displaced persons awaiting repatriation. The restrictions eased further. The barbed wire remained, but the guard towers were no longer constantly manned. The relationship between the former prisoners and the American staff evolved into something that approached friendship in some cases. Daichi's English was fluent now, good enough that he sometimes helped Sergeant Brennan with translation duties. He found himself in conversations with American soldiers talking about ordinary things: baseball, the weather, what they missed about home. The strange normalcy of it was disorienting. In October, a departure schedule was announced. The prisoners would be repatriated in groups transported by ship back to Japan. Daichi's group was scheduled to leave in early November. The news brought a mixture of emotions: joy at the prospect of going home, fear of what he would find there, the weight of having been comfortable while his country burned. Captain Hartwell hosted a farewell dinner for the prisoner leadership in late October. It was held in a small dining room usually reserved for officers. The food was the same as always, American cooking served with care, but the atmosphere was different, almost solemn. Hartwell stood to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, waiting for Brennan to translate, though many of them understood English well enough now. "I want you to know that your dignity and leadership have made this work. You helped your men adjust to a situation that must have been bewildering and frightening. That took wisdom and courage." Watanabe stood to respond. "Captain Hartwell," he said carefully, "you showed me that my enemies could be men of honor. You challenged everything I believed about Americans, about this conflict, about the meaning of duty and humanity. I do not know what I will find when I return to Japan, but I will never forget my time here, or the kindness shown to us when we expected only cruelty." There was a moment of silence. Then Daichi stood, surprising everyone, including himself. "Captain," he said in English, his accent still heavy, but his words clear, "you taught me something I will carry my whole life. You taught me that enemies can choose kindness over hate, that strength can include mercy, that a 17-year-old boy does not have to die to have honor. Thank you." Hartwell's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He walked around the table and extended his hand to Daichi. They shook hands, enemy and prisoner, captor and captive, two human beings, acknowledging each other across the ruins of war. Before the dinner ended, Daichi gave Hartwell something he had been working on for weeks: a hand-drawn portrait of the camp, the barracks and the mess hall and the Shinto shrine and the baseball field and the guard towers and the endless Wisconsin sky. It was the best work he had ever done, every detail precise, every line intentional. His months of practice had transformed simple sketching into genuine skill. "So you remember," Daichi said simply. Hartwell accepted the portrait with hands that trembled slightly. "I will treasure this," he said. "Thank you." Then Hartwell gave Daichi something in return, a pair of dog tags on a worn chain. "These belong to my brother Floyd," Hartwell said. "He died on Guadalcanal. You remind me of him. young and brave and trying to do right in a world gone mad. I think he would have wanted you to have these." Daichi took the dog tags carefully as if they were made of glass. He read the stamped metal. Lieutenant Floyd Hartwell, O positive, Protestant, the same blood type as Daichi. He looked up at Hartwell and could not find words adequate to the moment. He simply bowed deeply in the Japanese way, a bow of profound respect and gratitude. Watanabe, watching this exchange, made a decision. After the dinner, he returned to the barracks and retrieved his diary from its hiding place under his mattress. He had kept it faithfully for 20 months, documenting everything he had seen and felt and learned. It was the most honest thing he had ever written, a record of transformation and doubt and growing understanding. He found Captain Hartwell in his office and placed the diary on the desk. "If I die before my family receives this," Watanabe said through Brennan, "please send it to them. The address is written inside the front cover. My wife Tomoe and my daughters should know what happened here. They should know how we were treated. They should know the truth." Hartwell accepted the diary with the same care Daichi had shown with the dog tags. "I will keep it safe," he promised, "and I hope very much that you will be able to deliver it to them yourself." The morning of November 3rd was cold and clear. The first snow of the season had fallen during the night, just a dusting enough to turn the world white once more. Daichi stood on the platform at Camp McCoy, the same platform where he had arrived 20 months earlier, and looked at the landscape that had been his prison and his education. The train that would take them to the coast was waiting. Prisoners were filing aboard carrying their few belongings, wearing the same American-issued clothes they had been given on arrival. Daichi wore Floyd Hartwell's dog tags under his shirt against his skin, a weight that was both burden and comfort. Watanabe stood beside him. The older man looked smaller than he had when they arrived, as if something fundamental had been hollowed out of him. But his eyes were clear, and his bearing was still that of an officer, even now, even here, even after everything. "Are you ready?" Watanabe asked. Daichi thought about it. Was he ready to return to a Japan he barely remembered? A city that had been bombed into ruins, a mother who might be dead? Was he ready to carry this for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he had eaten well every day while his countrymen starved? "No," he said honestly, "but I think that is the point. We go anyway." The train journey east took 3 days. Then a ship from San Francisco crowded with hundreds of repatriated prisoners, all of them heading back to a homeland that existed now more in memory than in reality. The Pacific crossing took 2 weeks. Daichi spent much of it on deck, watching the ocean roll past, thinking about his mother, about Watanabe, about Captain Hartwell, about everything that had changed and everything that never would. The ship docked in Yokohama harbor in early December. The city that Daichi remembered from his childhood was gone. In its place was a landscape of rubble and ruin, buildings reduced to shells, streets choked with debris. But life was reasserting itself. People moved through the destruction with quiet determination, beginning the long work of rebuilding. Daichi made his way through streets he half recognized to the neighborhood where he had lived. The building was damaged, but still standing. The walls were scorched, several windows blown out, but the structure remained. He climbed the stairs with his heart hammering in his chest. He knocked on the door of the apartment that had been his home. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened and his mother stood there. Ayame Fujikawa was 46 years old, but looked 60. She weighed perhaps 78 pounds. Her face gaunt with starvation, her hair completely grey. She stared at Daichi as if seeing a ghost. Then recognition dawned, and she made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "Daichi," she whispered, "you are alive." They fell into each other's arms, both crying, both shaking with the force of reunion. Ayame pulled him inside and closed the door and just held him, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. "Your letter," she said. "I received only one, in July of last year. I thought maybe it was a dream. I thought you must have died." "I am here," Daichi said. "I am home." They sat together in the damaged apartment, and Daichi told her everything. about Camp McCoy, and the misunderstanding about the meal, and the medical care, and the Shinto shrine, and Captain Hartwell, and Watanabe, and baseball games, and English classes, and all of it. Ayame listened with wide eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. "Every day," she said finally, "while we were eating rice mixed with sawdust, while we were eating grass when we could find it." Her voice was not accusing, just stunned by the incomprehensible unfairness of it. "I know," Daichi said, and everything he had carried for 20 months crashed over him with renewed force. "Mother, I am so sorry. I ate well while you starved. I gained weight while you nearly died. What kind of son does that—" Ayame took his face in her thin hands and looked at him fiercely. "The kind of son who survives," she said. "The kind of son who comes home. Daichi, if you had died in that camp, whether from starvation or pride or shame, it would have killed me. But you lived. You are here. Now help me survive. Help me rebuild. That is what matters." And so he did. In the early years after his return, Tokyo was a city of ruins and hunger. Daichi found work as a translator with the American occupation forces. His fluent English made him valuable in ways his war service never had. The Americans he worked with were not so different from Captain Hartwell and Sergeant Brennan. Competent, professional, human. The work paid well enough to feed both him and his mother, to slowly nurse her back to health, to begin repairing their damaged apartment. It took 2 years before Ayame reached a healthy weight. 3 years before her hair began to show black again among the grey. She never spoke of what she had endured during the war years, and Daichi learned not to ask. Some silences were their own form of respect. He kept in touch with Watanabe, who had returned to find his wife Tomoe and daughters Emi and Hana alive, but struggling. The two men met perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, always in quiet places, always speaking in low voices about things they could not discuss with anyone else. Watanabe's daughters grew up not knowing that their father had kept a diary, had documented his transformation, had written honest words about doubt and change. In 1950, at age 23, Daichi married. His wife Chio was 21, a young woman who had lost her parents and 2 brothers in the March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo. Their first conversation was about survivor's guilt. Their second was about whether they had permission to be happy. Their third was about building something new from broken pieces. They had 2 daughters, Akiko in 1952, Yumi in 1955. Daichi taught them English, starting when they were small, the language that had once belonged to the enemy, now a gift he could give his children. He never told them about the misunderstanding on that first night, about eating well while their grandmother starved, about the year he spent gaining weight in captivity. Some stories were too complicated for children, and by the time they were old enough to understand, the words would not come. But he told them other things, about kindness being stronger than propaganda, about the importance of questioning what authority tells you, about seeing the human in the enemy. These lessons he could give, stripped of their origin story, passed down as simple truth. Over the years, Daichi wrote occasional letters to Captain Hartwell. The letters were warm, but not frequent. What could he say? "Thank you for treating me like a human being when you did not have to." The gratitude was too large for words. Hartwell responded with his own letters, brief updates about life in Iowa, about returning to teaching after the war, about his own marriage and children. The correspondence was sporadic but genuine. 2 men who had shared something profound, struggling to maintain connection across vast distances. In 1967, Watanabe died at the age of 65. His death was peaceful, surrounded by his family. Daichi attended the funeral and wept for the man who had been like a father to him. After the funeral, Watanabe's wife Tomoe approached Daichi. "He spoke of you often," she said. "He said you saved his life." "He saved mine," Daichi replied. Tomoe nodded. "I think you saved each other." She paused, then added quietly, "He kept a diary during the war, from Camp McCoy. He wanted it preserved. I have it in a safe place." Daichi did not ask to see it. That diary belonged to Watanabe's family, to his daughters, who might someday want to understand what their father had experienced. It was enough to know it existed. Daichi lived a good life, though the definition of good shifted over the years. He worked hard, raised his daughters, watched Japan rebuild itself into something new and prosperous. He saw the country transform from ruins into an economic power, saw the relationship with America evolve from enmity to alliance. The contradictions never fully resolved, but they became part of the fabric of his existence. He never forgot Camp McCoy. He never forgot that first meal, or the medical care, or the slow transformation from enemy to something approaching friend. He never forgot Captain Hartwell, or Sergeant Brennan, or Dr. Sheffield, or any of the Americans who had shown him that the world was more complex than propaganda allowed. In 1995, at the age of 68, Daichi tried to write a letter to Captain Hartwell. He had heard nothing from the American captain in several years and did not know if he was even still alive. But he felt compelled to try to express what Camp McCoy had meant to him. "Dear Captain Hartwell," he wrote in careful English, "I am now 68 years old. I never properly thanked you for what you did. That meal we thought was our execution became our first lesson in humanity. You taught a 17-year-old boy that enemies can choose mercy over cruelty. I have spent my life trying to teach this same lesson to others. I hope I have made you proud. Your student forever, Daichi Fujikawa." He addressed the envelope to the last address he had for Hartwell in Iowa, but then hesitated. What if Hartwell had moved? What if he had died? The letter sat on Daichi's desk for weeks while he tried to decide whether to mail it or find updated contact information first. Life intervened, as it always does. His daughter Yumi announced her engagement. His mother, now 96, needed increasing care. The letter remained unmailed, sitting in a drawer, a conversation never completed. Daichi died in 2001 at the age of 74. His death was peaceful, surrounded by his daughters and grandchildren. His final words were about kindness being stronger than propaganda, about the importance of questioning what you are told. His daughters did not fully understand what he meant, but they remembered. He died believing several things: that his letter to Captain Hartwell had never been sent, that Watanabe's diary was safely preserved with Watanabe's family, that the story of Camp McCoy existed only in his memory and in the fading memories of other survivors. He was wrong about all of it. In 2018, Watanabe's grandson Kenji was renovating the family home in Yokohama when he found a box in the attic. The house had belonged to his grandmother Tomoe, who had died the previous year at 98. The attic had been her domain, and now, sorting through 50 years of accumulated belongings, he found a diary wrapped in silk cloth, preserved as if it was sacred. A note in his grandmother's handwriting was tucked inside the front cover. "Your grandfather wanted this safe. He said someday someone would understand why it mattered. I have kept it for him. Make sure it reaches someone who will honor his truth. Tomoe, 1969. Kenji, who knew little of his grandfather's war experience, began to read. He learned about the misunderstanding on the first night, about young Daichi Fujikawa saving his grandfather's life in the timber cutting accident, about the slow transformation from enemy to something approaching friend, about Captain Hartwell and the Americans who had treated prisoners with humanity when they could have chosen cruelty. The entry from August 12, 1944, made him cry. "Today, young Daichi Fujikawa saved my life. A tree fell during timber cutting and he pushed me clear. He took the blow himself. He is like a son to me." Kenji did research. He found that Daichi had died in 2001. He discovered Daichi's daughter Akiko through online records and contacted her, explaining what he had found. Akiko wept when she read the diary entry about her father saving Watanabe's life. "He never told us," she said when she met Kenji at a coffee shop in Tokyo. "He never mentioned it even once. We knew he had been a prisoner. We knew he learned English at the camp. But this," she touched the diary gently, "this changes everything." 1 year later, in 2019, something else happened. Sarah Hartwell, the 70-year-old daughter of Captain Clayton Hartwell, was cleaning out her father's house in Iowa. He had died in 1998, and she had put off this task for years, unable to face the finality of sorting through his belongings. In the attic, she found a box marked Camp McCoy, important. Inside was Daichi's hand-drawn portrait of the camp carefully preserved behind glass. Beside it was Watanabe's diary, which Hartwell had apparently kept safe all these years, waiting for the right moment to return it to Watanabe's family. And beside that, an envelope. The envelope contained a letter dated November 1995. It was addressed to her father but had never been opened. Paper clipped to it was a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Mr. Hartwell, this was found in my father Daichi Fujikawa's desk after his death in 2001. It was addressed to you, but never mailed. I thought you should have it. I hope this finds you well. Akiko Fujikawa, March 2002. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the letter and read her father's response, apparently written, but never sent, found paper-clipped to Daichi's unmailed letter. Dear Daichi, if you are reading this, I hope it means we found each other again across all the years and distance. I think of you often. I think of all the men at Camp McCoy, and I hope they found peace after the war. You were right about that first meal. It was an education for all of us. You taught me that the young can be wiser than the old, that enemies can become friends, that kindness is not weakness. I am proud to have known you, your teacher and your friend, Clayton Hartwell. 2 letters, both written in 1995, neither sent. Both expressing the same truth, that a misunderstanding about a meal in a Wisconsin prison camp in 1944 had changed lives in ways that echoed across decades. Sarah cried reading them. Then she did research and found Akiko through the letter that had accompanied Daichi's unmailed correspondence. In October 2019, Sarah and Akiko met at Camp McCoy, which still operated as a military installation, but now also housed a museum documenting its history during World War II. The museum had recently opened an exhibition called The Meal That Changed Everything. It displayed Watanabe's diary behind glass, open to the entry from February 14, 1944. It showed Daichi's portrait of the camp professionally framed. It held Floyd Hartwell's dog tags, which Akiko had found among her father's most precious belongings, and donated to the museum. It told the story of 183 Japanese prisoners who came to Wisconsin expecting execution and found something else entirely. Sarah and Akiko stood before the display together, both crying, both holding hands across the gap of nations and generations, and all the years between that first evening and this moment of remembrance. Your father saved my father's life, Akiko said quietly. Your father taught my father that mercy was stronger than hate, Sarah replied. They stayed at the museum for hours reading the diary entries, examining the portrait, touching the dog tags that had passed from Floyd to Clayton to Daichi, and now rested here completing a circle none of the original participants could have imagined. The final panel of the exhibition displayed both letters side by side. Daichi's unsent gratitude, Clayton's unsent response. 2 men who had never stopped thinking about each other, who had carried their connection across decades and continents, who had both tried to reach across the distance one final time and failed. Or perhaps not failed. Perhaps the letters reaching their intended recipients 17 years too late was exactly the right time. Perhaps Sarah and Akiko standing together, crying and holding hands, was the real completion of the conversation their fathers had begun in 1944. Beneath the letters, a simple quote from Daichi's final words to his family. Kindness is stronger than propaganda. Question everything. See the human in the enemy. The story did not end there. It could not. Stories like this do not end. They continue in the hearts of those who hear them, in the lessons they teach, in the choices they inspire. Sarah and Akiko became friends. They corresponded regularly, visiting each other in Iowa and Tokyo. They gave talks together at schools and universities about their father's experiences, about the dangers of dehumanizing enemies, about the possibility of transformation, even in conflict. The Camp McCoy Museum became a destination for people interested in stories of reconciliation and humanity during wartime. School groups toured the exhibition. Veterans from both countries visited and shared their own stories. The portrait Daichi had drawn, the diary Watanabe had kept, the dog tags Floyd had worn, became relics of something important, proof that even in the darkest times, people could choose kindness over cruelty. In the museum gift shop, they sold postcards of Daichi's portrait. On the back was printed a simple message: in February 1944, 183 Japanese prisoners arrived at this camp, believing they would be executed. Instead, they received an education in humanity that would last the rest of their lives. That first meal was never just about food. It was a question. It was a challenge. It was a crack in a wall of propaganda that let light seep through. And the lesson it taught, that enemies can choose to see each other as human, that mercy is possible even in war, that our beliefs about the world can change when confronted with evidence that contradicts them. That lesson remains as urgent now as it was 80 years ago. One meal at a time, one choice at a time, one act of mercy at a time. The education continues.